Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture for child psychology on Chapter 16, Socio-Emotional Development in Adolescence. So today for this chapter, some of the things we're going to focus on are talking about identity, self-esteem, and emotional development. We're also going to talk about the process and importance of identity formation. We're going to talk about changes in your family and peer relationships. We're going to go over a few cultural differences in adolescent development. And then lastly, we're going to identify problems related to socio-emotional development and explain how to develop healthy coping skills. So the first thing we're going to talk about is identity formation. So first question is, what is identity? So identity encompasses a whole range of factors, including your career choices, your religious views, your personal relationships, your intellectual ability, your interests, sexual identity, ethnic identity. It could be hobbies, personality, as well as physical identity. So that's some of the things that your textbook lists as all of the things that could encompass your identities. So just think about it as if you were answering the question, who are you? And all the different things that you might list to describe yourself. So this is like if you set up a dating profile, these are things that you usually answer. It usually asks about your religious views, what kind of career you have, all of those kinds of things. So your identity is especially during adolescence, is in development. The way that happens is through negotiations and affirmations of various roles and facets of identity. So as you know, with Erikson's point of view, identity formation is what is really happening in this adolescent age, where you're trying on different roles, trying to figure out what you like, what you don't like. A lot of adolescents will go through this in religious views specifically. So a lot of times what you see on average is that if you grow up in a religious home, you might reject that religion and either pick a different one or just be more like on the non-religious side throughout adolescence and maybe even early 20s. But then eventually, as you get older, you kind of go back to your religion that you grew up with. You might see this same kind of pattern with political views as well, and maybe some other aspects of your identity that comes from your parents specifically. So identity versus identity confusion is Erikson's stage of development. So what he said was that individuals experience a crisis of identity versus identity confusion, in which they are faced with deciding who they are, what their values are, and where they are going in life. The search is aided by a psychosocial moratorium. And so this is Erikson's term for the gap between childhood security and adult autonomy. So you kind of have this, basically what he was saying was that adolescence is this stage where it's safe to explore. And as you'll see when we get to cultural differences, this isn't the same across cultures. Not here in America, we definitely have that safe time where you're not treated necessarily as a child, but you're not like living on your own, trying to pay bills, taking care of children. For on average, most American teenagers are living at home in a relatively safe space where they can take the time to explore different roles without having serious consequences on their life. And as you'll see, that's not the case for adolescents across the world, or even in some situations in America. A lot of kids are forced to grow up earlier because they don't have that safe space. They do have to live on their own or work or those kinds of things. We'll talk about some more differences there in a minute. But that's Erikson's view. So he said that teenagers are relatively free of responsibilities and have freedom to try different roles. Again, that's on average. That's of course, there's teenagers out there that don't fit into that category. They may change their mind about what they want to be when they grow up frequently, and they may change their style of dress, their hair, the way they talk, or the type of activities they're involved in. So again, think back to your time in high school, and you probably did things that you don't do now, like you might have dressed differently, or you might have dyed your hair blue, which you may not consider doing now. You may have worn your makeup differently, like all those different kind of things. Even if you switch from clique to clique to clique, if you're in one clique and you dress a certain way, but then you start making different friends next year, so you're in a different clique, you change your way of dress, the way that you talk, the language that you use. Those kinds of things will change as you're trying to figure out who you are, essentially. So there's another theory, which is Marcia's identity theory. Um, and this theory breaks Erikson's identity crisis into four statuses. So here's the chart from your textbook. So the four statuses are here, and then these are an easy way to remember it. So has the person made a commitment, yes or no? And has the person explored meaningful alternatives regarding some identity question, yes or no? So I'll go over these really quickly. But basically what she said was that what determines a person's identity status is the existence or extent of their crisis. And again, crisis is a period during which an individual explores alternatives. You could also call it commitment, which is what they call it here. So this also means crisis or commitment. And the four statuses are identified as follows. So with identity diffusion, there's no crisis and no commitment. So whenever you say, has a person explored meaningful alternatives regarding some identity question, they're not exploring it, and they have not made a commitment. So they're an identity diffusion. And this person usually would show little interest in occupational or ideological choices. So you could kind of think of it as like whatever you grew up with, that's what you're sticking with. You're not exploring different options or really trying to change that in any way. Identity foreclosure. You do make a commitment, but no crisis has actually been experienced. So this is, again, an identity may be forced on them by a parent, and they haven't had the opportunity to explore on their own. So where here there's no desire to explore. Here it's like purposely being forbidden. So they haven't had the opportunity to explore, whereas if you're in identity fusion, you don't even care to explore at all. Identity moratorium is you're in the midst of a crisis, but you have made no commitment. So this is be similar to what Erikson said all adolescents go through. So you're going through that crisis, that process of trying to explore different alternatives, and you have not made a commitment to one yet. And then lastly, identity achievement is where you've undergone the crisis and have made a commitment. So again, in Erikson's view, all adolescents are here, and then eventually this is where they're trying to get, is where you've gone through exploring different identities, and now you've made a commitment to one. And in Erikson's view, again, if you end up in the identity confusion stage, you would not end up in identity achievement because you wouldn't have been able to come out with a clear identity of who you. So some researchers believe that the most important identity changes take place during emerging adulthood, which is the period from 18 to 25 years of age. Resolution of the identity issue during adolescence or emerging adulthood does not mean that identity will be stable through the remainder of life. So in a lot of people's view, we are constantly going through this no matter how old you are. So you're constantly going through changes through moratorium to achievement, back to moratorium, back to achievement. So the old view was that from Erikson's that everyone's in identity moratorium during adolescence, and then eventually you end up here. The new view is that we're constantly kind of going back and forth. So just think about, for yourself, out of high school, you went to college, or maybe you're older and you've been working for a long time and now you're back in college. You're definitely going to have some identity changes because college opens you up to a whole new world, all different viewpoints, different people. So you're definitely going to be in this moratorium stage again, no matter how old you are. So that kind of lends to the idea that we don't just go through this in adolescence, but we keep going through it. Okay, so now let's talk about relationships and some emotional development stuff. Development, adolescents report more extreme fleeting emotions than adults. They also are more likely than pre-adolescents to report mildly negative mood states. So this goes back to the puberty chapter you read about and hormonal changes and stuff like that. So we do see those extreme emotions that have come about really quickly, but then also go away really quickly. Being able to control one's emotions is an important aspect of adolescent development, and because you do have these crazy emotional roller coasters, it's really important to be able to have some control over that so that you can make good decisions. Okay, so with relationships, we're going to first talk about family relationships. So parent-child relationships. So adolescence usually brings about changes in the relationship between the parent and the child. One issue and key to a healthy relationship is parental monitoring. So a key aspect of the role of the parent is effective monitoring, which is especially important in the adolescent years. This could include a parent supervising who their child is friends with, where they hang out, how they are doing in school. Those kinds of things would fall under parent supervising. And as we previously discussed, parental monitoring can prevent the use of drugs, alcohol, and lead to a better academic performance. So this goes back to the types of parental styles. Um, but having a parent who's involved in your life, who's making sure that you're doing what you're supposed to do, that you're not getting involved with a bad crowd or with drugs, all those kinds of things can really keep a child safe. So again, thinking about those parenting styles, you want a parent who's involved, so not a parent who is neglecting their child and just has. Parents engage in positive parenting practices such as asking questions, being accepting, etc. Adolescents are more likely to disclose information. So that's one issue with parental monitoring is you have to be able to get information from your child, and especially now with technology and everything being on the phone or the computer, it's really easy to hide information. So it's not helpful if the parent can't access what the child is actually doing. Um, they're not really able to monitor them that way. So it's whenever we think about our parenting styles, authoritative parenting is usually more successful because they it's more of a relationship and less like a dictatorship kind of. So you as a teenager have a role in that relationship and are respected, and you know that your parent cares about what you actually think and what you say, and that they're not going to judge you, kinds of things. That makes it a lot more likely that they're going to tell you things. So some ways that parents can go about doing this is just simply asking questions. They can create rules about disclosure, so things like they can't have a passcode on their computer, etc. Or they can snoop around. So clearly, what I was just talking about was snooping is probably not the best because it's seen as a violation of privacy, and this usually does not happen. And if it does, it often indicates that there's bigger problems in the family. And again, that was about snooping. Okay, so let's move on to autonomy and attachment. So at this stage, parents may be shocked or angered when their teenager begins pushing for autonomy. Basically, just meaning that the teenager wants to make their own decisions, they want to be their own person, and they don't want mom or dad that involved anymore. So parents may be angered by this because they may feel like their child is drifting away from them, and they think that their child needs them in order to navigate this difficult time of adolescence. As we have seen throughout childhood, parents should relinquish control to the child in an area they feel the child can make competent decisions. So at this stage, adolescents are old enough to make a lot of their own decisions. But we've seen this whenever we talked about toddlers even, and how parents should let go and let toddlers like try to dress themselves or brush their own teeth, and that is really important for them. So we're still just continuing that where, okay, you know that your child is capable of making good decisions about whenever they go out with their friends, that they know they're supposed to be home at a certain time and that they shouldn't, let's say, drink and drive, and you know that they're competent and they've never messed up before, so you're going to let them go hang out with their friends Friday night and not worry too much about it. And maybe there's other areas of their life where they need more help, like maybe they're not great at waking up on time for school, so you still have to kind of make sure that they get up on time and get out the door on time. And so just where it's going to be different for everyone. Whatever areas you feel your child is competent in, you can relinquish a little bit of control in that area while still maintaining control in other areas where they need help, rather than trying to control every single aspect of their life. So on average, what we see is that boys are generally granted more autonomy than girls because of their gender roles. Boys are typically given more independence. That's not surprising. We've talked about that pretty much at every stage as well. And this might be reflected in things like at what age they're allowed to go out on a date, to hang out with friends without supervision, wearing makeup, buying their own clothes, driving a car, etc. These are all areas that autonomy comes into play. Okay, and then the role of attachment. Studies have found that securely attached adolescents are less likely to engage in problems, behaviors, and are likely to have better peer relations than their insecurely attached counterparts. Again, this is stuff that we've talked about, at every stage, and that attachment you form in infancy is really important, and it plays into your other relationships as well. And then lastly, let's talk about conflict. So early adolescence is a time of heightened conflict. The most conflict involves the everyday events of family life. So things like teenagers not keeping their room clean, talking about grades and curfews, phone use, those kinds of things. It rarely involves major dilemmas like drug use or anything like that. It escalates during adolescence, early adolescence. It's stable throughout high school and lessens in adulthood. It gets even more positive if the child leaves to go to college compared to if the child stays at home while in college. And this all probably just goes back to the autonomy issue. You tend to see more conflict whenever parents are too controlling in the teenager's view of their lives. Okay, so let's move on to talking about peer relationships now. So things that are going on here. So friendship, let's start there. During adolescence, friends become increasingly important in meeting social needs, including an intensifying need for intimacy. The ups and downs of experiences with friends tends to shape adult well-being. Being popular with peers is a strong motivator, but in adolescence, kids start to prefer smaller, more intimate friend groups. And having healthy relationships and friends that stay out of trouble is more beneficial. The standards for peer groups and the influence of crowds and cliques become increasingly important during adolescence. Yet, I'm sure you guys know that from your own experience, and also like every teenage movie. Peer pressure is a big thing. So in early adolescence, conformity to peers reaches a maximum, especially with respect to antisocial behavior. This peaks around 8th and 9th grade. And this is more typical in children that have low self-esteem and high social anxiety. So, if you really want to fit in and you feel like you don't, you're going to conform more to peer pressure to try to feel like you have friends, feel like you're a part of a group, and like you won't get shunned or made fun of or anything like that. A little bit more on cliques and crowds. These are really important in the lives of adolescents. They can provide a group identity, a mode of gaining self-esteem, and or an outlet for self-expression. The way your book defines it is that cliques on average are about 5 to 6 individuals, usually of the same sex and age, while crowds are larger groups and are typically based on reputation. So like a crowd might be like all athletes in the school, but you might have a smaller clique of like just let's say female players, or maybe even a specific position that you play in soccer. Maybe just like those people are a clique, but they're also a part of the larger crowd of athletes in general in the school. And as we've talked about, increasingly school just becomes more and more part of their daily lives as children grow. So of course, friends and peer groups are going to become really important in their life and their self-esteem and well-being. Okay, and then of course we have to talk about dating. So adolescents spend a considerable amount of time dating or thinking about dating. Dating can serve a few different purposes in adolescence. So just simply having fun, it can serve to boost your status among your peers. It allows adolescents to start to develop intimacy and identity. And also, of course, you might find a long-term mate. You've heard the term high school sweethearts, where they started dating in high school and ended up getting married and spending the rest of their lives together. So that's typical or more typical for later adolescence. In early adolescence, thinking like middle school and stuff, you don't really see intimacy development start there. So there are different dating variations across adolescence. So of course we have heterosexual relationships are going to be different than your sexual minority relationships. So in heterosexual romantic relationships, there are 3 different stages. entering into romantic attractions at about 11 to 13 years of age. So this is at the beginning of puberty. It typically develops as a crush, even if you don't interact with that person. So you might just have a crush on someone that you never actually talk to. Dating typically occurs in a group setting at this age. So again, we're talking about 11 to 13 years of age. If you do date someone, it's typically in a group setting where you have lots of friends there, and you're just all kind of hanging out. But this, again, also the stage at the beginning of puberty, you tend to see where crushes start to develop, but you don't actually like interact with that person. The next stage is exploring romantic relationships, which is around 14 to 16. So you have casual relationships occur that last about a few months, at most a few months. Friends are usually involved in communicating one another's interest and seeing if the interest is returned, and group dates still occur often. So this is like where if you've ever had a friend that like you've told like, oh, I like so and then they go and tell that person so and so likes you, do you like them too, and kind of like that kind of thing back and forth like kids do. And again, you still see a lot of group dates at this stage. And the last stage is called consolidating dyadic romantic bonds, which is around 17 to 19 years of age. And basically, this is just where relationships start to look more adult-like and they can last up to a year or more. Okay, so in sexual minority youth, many sexual minority youth date other sex peers, which come to clarify their sexual orientation or disguise it from others. Um, Most gay and lesbian youth have had some same-sex sexual experience, often with peers who are experimenting, and then go on to primarily heterosexual orientation. Relatively few gay and lesbian youth have had same-sex romantic relationships. So basically what's happening here is if you have a teenager who identifies as gay, they may date girls to either hide their sexual identity or to confirm their sexual orientation. And often what you see is that the issue is that not everyone feels comfortable coming out to their peers or to their family. So essentially, like your options are just limited. It's not like everyone just feels comfortable to be who they are and say their sexual orientation is. So that's why that last point was that relatively few gay and lesbian youth have had same-sex romantic relationships. So there is some social cultural context we have to talk about here. So sociocultural values and religious beliefs often dictate the age at which dating begins, how much freedom in dating is allowed, and what the roles of males and females are in dating. So parents who have immigrated to the US may have an especially difficult time with dating. They may have more conservative attitudes about dating and may not have experienced dating themselves, especially like if you have come from a culture where you have arranged marriages. You may not even know like what dating is or what it's all about, what to expect. So this can lead to clashes between parent and child, especially if the child adopts the U.S. attitudes towards dating. And in their eyes, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but their parents think that it is a really big deal and have more rules around that. Another thing to talk about is online dating. So connecting online works for some and not for others. Some argue that online dating is not appropriate for even college students. Um, I wish we were in person so I could get your opinion on this, because I think that was really shocking to me the first time I read this textbook, that argument about that even college students shouldn't be using online dating. I've definitely heard the argument for obviously high school students, but I've never heard that argument for college students. There are some benefits and downsides, of course, to online dating. Um, some people say that you don't form as strong of a connection as you would if you were talking to someone in person, but on the other side, a lot of people say that they feel like they create even more intimacy talking to someone online and then meeting them in person. And teaching this class in the past, I've had students who have spoken up and said that they actually met their partner online and they're still together, or they ended up getting married, and they felt like they had a really strong relationship. So it is really interesting. So I might make that like a discussion board post just to get your thoughts on that, what you think about that. But for now, let's switch over and talk about cultural influences, because this is really interesting to me as well. So there's different traditions and changes in adolescence around the globe. So A lot of this whole class mostly focuses on um, child development in the US and Western culture, and it's specifically for adolescence. And your textbook already talks about, how there might be another period called emerging adulthood, um, and that's specifically for us, changing. But the period of what adolescence is can change depending on what part of the world you're on and what culture you live in. So you have different experiences at this age depending on where you are. So I'm just going to read a couple of those. So, 2/3 of Asian adolescents have arranged marriages. In the Middle East, many adolescents are not allowed to interact with the other sex, even in school. Street youth in Kenya and other parts of the world live under very stressful circumstances and often turn to delinquency and sex work in order to survive. Youth in Russia are marrying earlier to legitimize sexual activity. So as you can see, depending on where you are in the world, the period of adolescence will be and what is expected and what challenges you face. The experience of male and female adolescents in many cultures continues to be quite different. Female access to educational opportunities, careers, and leisure activities is restricted in many countries, although the gender differences do appear to be narrowing. Peer relationships, peers can take a strong role in adolescence in some countries, while peer relations are restricted in others. And then, of course, we have rites of passage. So some societies have elaborate ceremonies that signal that adolescents move to maturity and achievement of adult status. Such rites of passage may allow adolescents to gain access to adult practices, knowledge, and/or sexuality, and may involve practices intended to facilitate adolescent separation from the immediate family. So maybe like quinceañera, a bar mitzvah. Um, if you're you in certain religions, you may have like a confirmation, like those kinds of things that signal that you're moving on into adulthood. Even just like a sweet 16 could be considered a rite of passage. And so different cultures have different celebrations or ceremonies of that. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is some problems that we see in adolescence. So the first one is juvenile delinquency. A juvenile delinquent is an adolescent who breaks the law or engages in behavior that is considered illegal. Juvenile delinquency is a broad concept and encompasses legal infractions that range from littering to murder. So there's a lot that can go on in there, but anything that's illegal, and if you're a juvenile, that's juvenile delinquency. For both genders, rates of property offenses are higher than for other offenses. Arrest rates are higher for males than for females. The causes of delinquency. Predictors of delinquency include living in communities with high crime rates, low SES status, family issues, lack of parental monitoring, inappropriate or inconsistent discipline, hostile sibling relationships, and having delinquent siblings or peers. Lack of academic success is also associated with delinquency. So I'm going to have you guys, for one of your assignments this week, you're going to watch a video, or a film really, about juvenile delinquency and prison sentences and those kinds of things. And this is going to really tie in with your cognitive development chapter as well, and the frontal lobe. And, a lot of reasons why adolescents make bad decisions is because their brain isn't fully developed, and they have all these hormonal changes on. They're trying to fit in with their peers. They may be having family issues, and so that can contribute a lot to this kind of behavior. So the film that I'm going to have you watch talks about adolescents who have been sentenced to life in prison, and just kind of like if that's a good practice or not. So you can kind of learn a little bit more about that when you watch the film. But let's talk about successful prevention and intervention. That's going to be our last. So the 4 problems that affect most adolescents are 1, being drug abuse, 2, juvenile delinquency, 3, sexual problems, and 4, school-related problems. It has been found that for many adolescents, they engage in 2 to 3 of these behaviors, so not usually just one. Like if you're doing drugs, you're probably involved in some kind of juvenile delinquency. You probably have school-related problems as well. These So 3 strategies that may provide support for at-risk adolescents include intensive individualized attention, where an adult gives the adolescent attention and deals with their specific needs. So this is a popular theme in many programs. Community-wide multi-agency collaboration, so many programs and services have to be in place. Curriculum in schools plus substance abuse programs can be things that can be helpful. So, addressing many different needs in many different ways in the community. Early identification and intervention, intervening at a young age has been successful. So there's a preschool program called Perry Preschool Program, which was implemented for disadvantaged Black children. In addition to the high quality preschool, they received weekly at-home visits. So those kids at age 19 were less likely to have delinquency issues. So early intervention is really important. The intervention where you can prevent some of these issues from even happening in the first place. Okay, well, that's all I have for you for this chapter. So now you can go watch the film and fill out that discussion sheet.